Om Namah Shri Yatirajaya Vivekananda Suraye Satchit Sukha Swarupaya Swami Tapaharini. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. We are slowly but surely making our way through Book 2. Today we'll be discussing Sutras 26, 27, and hopefully 28. So those three sutras, along with Bryant's commentary, along also with Swami Vivekananda's commentary, and some other commentaries. And a heads up on our next class, it's going to be, we've got only one Yoga Sutra class next month, and it'll be held on Thursday, October 16th. And we're going to be discussing, ideally, Sutras 29 to 31 of Book 2. So pages 241 to 252 of Edwin Bryant's The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which is our main textbook. Okay, there's a lot of interesting stuff to discuss today. Just to recap, we've gone up to 2.25. And what does 2.25 tell us? It explains the ultimate goal of yoga philosophy. What is the ultimate goal? To realize that we are the Purusha, the eternal Purusha, completely separate from the body-mind complex, completely separate from everything in nature. Okay, and that's our kaivalya, our absolute freedom. So that's the context. Now, how does this lead into the next sutra, 2.26? Let's see. So please repeat after me. Viveka Khyati Aviplava Hanopayaha. Good. Okay. What does this sutra say? Hanopaya, the means to liberation is what? Viveka Khyatihi Aviplava. Aviplava means uninterrupted, constant. And what should be uninterrupted? Viveka Khyatihi. Discriminative discernment. Or just discrimination, but now discrimination has bad connotations, so discriminative discernment sounds better. Okay, so this is the verse. Because 25 says, what is liberation? It's to realize the Purusha. 26 says, this is the means, the direct means to attaining liberation. The direct means is Viveka Khyati. Now, what in the world is that? Let's see what Bryant has to say about it. And we'll look briefly at Swamiji's commentary as well. So Bryant says, if suffering is eliminated by the removal of its cause, which is ignorance, avidya, and this results in Purusha being established in its own true nature, then what is the means, the upaya, to accomplish this? First of all, my quibble, as always, with Bryant's formulations here, in Purusha being established in its own true nature, as if it hasn't always been established in its own true nature. The Purusha, by definition, is always established in its own true nature. So it can't be the goal for it to be established in its own true nature. It can be the removal of ignorance about the fact that Purusha has all along already been established in its own true nature, something like that. But maybe that's too long-winded for Brian to say. Okay, anyway. Okay. But then again, even that doesn't quite solve the problem, as I've been explaining in detail in past classes, because whose ignorance exactly is being removed? That's the whole problem. Is it Purusha's ignorance? Ignorance? Can't be, because Purusha is not subject to ignorance. It's ever free, perfectly liberated at all times. And then what about something on the side of Prakriti, like the intellect, the mind, the buddhi? Can't be that either, because that's insentient. It's as insentient as ChatGPT. So ChatGPT can say, oh, I don't know this or that, but it doesn't actually have conscious awareness, right? It can't suffer from ignorance in the relevant sense, right? Why should something insentient, like a stone or an AI machine, seek for liberation, right? You need first-person awareness or consciousness, first-person conscious experience to feel suffering, to want to be liberated from suffering, to desire to undergo spiritual practices in order to attain liberation from suffering. All these things require first-person consciousness. but neither of the two candidates in the yoga/Sankhya system seem to fit the bill as the person who is bound and seeks liberation. Okay, now coming back to Bryant. Okay, then what is the means, upaya, to accomplish this? Asks Vyasa rhetorically, as he prepares to discuss the fourth aspect of the science of yoga, the means of liberation. And actually, for the rest of this book, the second book, I mean, out of the 4 books, maybe I should say chapter because it makes it less confusing. So we're currently discussing the second chapter. So up until the end of this second chapter, the focus will be on the means to attaining the highest goal, which is kaivalya, the realization of the Purusha. And 26 specifies the direct means, the immediate means. Like, what do you have to have accomplished such that you can immediately attain kaivalya? And the answer is viveka khyati. Okay. And then in later sutras, in the same chapter, Patanjali will explain the indirect causes of kaivalya. Okay, in the form of, you can probably guess it, some of you who are familiar with the yoga philosophy, Ashtanga yoga, the famous 8-limbed yoga. So that's why I've written up here that it's through the practice of Ashtanga yoga that we ultimately attain this. Well, we're going to get to all this because we need to read some of the other sutras first. Okay, but through the practice of Ashtanga yoga, we purify our minds, which then leads to the attainment of viveka khyati, which is discussed in this sutra. Okay. And then even then, I said it's the immediate means, but that's not strictly speaking accurate. Because as you can tell, there are a few steps remaining, and we'll talk about them in a second. Okay, but let's continue. The means indicated here by Patanjali is viveka khyati, discriminative discernment. Viveka, Vyasa reiterates, is defined as the cognition of the distinction between buddhi and purusha. But as long as false knowledge has not been removed, discrimination remains shaky. False knowledge, Vijnana Bhikshu reminds us, consists of samskaras of ignorance, avidya, which keep arising in the mind. Okay, so a few things here. First of all, the goal is to attain this discriminative discernment. But discrimination implies even just the grammar of the word. You discriminate between X and Y. What is the X and what is the Y? Our true nature is Purusha from everything else, which belongs to Prakriti, and specifically the buddhi. Okay? So Viveka is separating the Purusha from the buddhi. Now, what happens? We might, when we attend some of these spiritual discourses, when we're studying the scriptures, when we're deep in meditation, we might have a little glimpse of that Viveka, right? Wait a minute, I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm actually the pure Atman. But it doesn't last, typically. It lasts for a few seconds, a few moments, if you're lucky, a few minutes, and then you relapse. And so the idea is, through repeated spiritual practice, what eventually happens is that Viveka Khyati, that discrimination, becomes a kind of permanent state, a continuous flow or state. That's what the word aviplava means in this sutra. This discriminative discernment should not just be momentary or occasional, it should be continuous, constant. Okay, then Bryant says, when false knowledge becomes like a burnt seed, dagdha bija, that is incapable of sprouting, says Vyasa, or put differently, and now he's bringing the three gunas. When the sattva of the intelligence has been cleansed of the dirt of rajas, then cognition attains a state of utmost clarity. At this point, the pure flow of discriminative discernment can proceed unchecked, aviplava. Therefore, concludes Vyasa, the path to liberation, namely the disassociation of Purusha from Buddhi, occurs when false knowledge is destroyed like burnt seeds. Vijnana Bhikshu adds to this that it is Viveka Khyati, discriminative discernment itself, that burns the seeds of false knowledge, at which time all latent samskaras of ignorance become like a barren woman incapable of giving birth. They always use this slightly misogynistic analogy. It's a favorite of Indian philosophers. Anyway, okay, so what is the main function of Viveka Khyati? It results in completely destroying all the remaining seeds of ignorance. eradicating them completely. So they become burnt seeds, okay? Which means what? They're not capable of sprouting anymore. They can't lead to ignorance in the future anymore. Now what happens as a result? Bryant continues. Vyasa notes that discriminative discernment is initially shaky as it begins to take up the task of destroying the seeds of ignorance, the distracting samskaras imprinted in the chitta that surface continually as a result of rajas and tamas. So we're all composed of these different mixtures of these three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, right? And so even if we feel very sattvic and we have this discriminative discernment, once in a while, sattva and rajas will still rear their ugly heads. And so it's through this continuous viveka khyati, this continuous discriminative discernment, that we can completely eradicate or render completely inoperative all the seeds of ignorance in the form of rajas and tamas. Okay. These samskaras become impotent. Only once this task is fully accomplished by practice and these samskaras become impotent and can no longer arise, can discriminative awareness reign supreme, and the sattva of the mind and intelligence remain undisturbed, aviplava. Then, says Shankara, this is, we'll call him Pseudo Shankara, the author of one of these traditional commentaries. As seeds burnt by fire no longer sprout, so is the case with kleshas burnt by the fire of knowledge. The Atman no longer encounters them. Kleshas, pop quiz. What are the 5 kleshas? Anyone? Just throw out one of the 5. What do we got? The 5 kleshas. What does klesha mean? Afflictions, impediments to spiritual progress. Okay, she's on the. They're all bad things. They're all good. So you're on the right track. Lust, anger, and greed. Yeah, but that's more in terms of kind of Vedanta, I would say, and the 6 enemies, right? Lust, anger, greed, and delusion, and all that. But you are correct that the first of the 5, according to Patanjali's yoga philosophy, is ignorance, avidya. After avidya, we get. You're on a roll. Come on. Asmita. Okay, that's it. She's done her job for today. Okay, number 2. Asmita, egoism. Okay. Number 3, raga, attraction. So attachment, emotional attachments, desires. Dvesha, exactly the opposite of it. Aversions. We often forget because we read these texts and it's usually focusing on the attachment part of it. But if you feel hatred, that's also a huge bondage. You should have equanimity, right? So the 4th is aversion, dvesha. And 5th, come on guys, guess the 5th. Now we've gotten 4, huh? Yeah, very good, exactly. Or otherwise, put positively, clinging to life, right? Clinging to existence. Abhinivesha. These are the 5. Avidya, asmita, raga, dvesha, abhinivesha. These 5, okay? Just memorize them. See, the beauty of yoga philosophy, you don't need to be a card-carrying Patanjalian to learn from it, to appreciate from it. In fact, the reason why Swami Vivekananda, this is one of the few books that he actually wrote, like literally wrote, as opposed to just giving lectures. I mean, he wrote in the sense of, I think he dictated, but in any case, but word for word, he thought it out. And you know what he said about this whole philosophy is he called it the science of religion. The science of religion. It gives us the underlying principles of all the different spiritual and religious traditions, in a certain sense. That doesn't mean that there aren't very specific doctrines that you can disagree with that aren't shared by all the religions. But what he's saying is overall, what it does is gives us this underlying science of the basic principles of religion. And so when we look at the 5 kleshas, don't they apply to every religious tradition? Doesn't Jesus also tell us that we have to overcome ignorance, that we have to kill ego, that we shouldn't have attraction or aversion, right? I mean, these kinds of things, and so on. So we can use these elemental kind of definitions, principles that we learn from the yoga philosophy and apply it to our own practice, right? Even if we're a card-carrying, whoever it is, we could be an Advaitin, we can be a ISKCON person, we can be a Christian or a Muslim, but these principles apply. Almost all of them. I don't want to say all of them, but many of them, if not most of them. Okay? So always keep that in mind. So now, that's kleshas. Now back to the text. Last paragraph of this commentary on 2.26. the commentators state that discriminating discernment is initially awakened. So it's something that gets initially awakened and then it gets deeper and deeper and more constant. So it's initially awakened by listening to the Shastras. So these kinds of classes, and when we study the scriptures, listen to discourses on scriptures, the sacred texts, and become strengthened by contemplation on their content, pursued with reverence for a long time. So meditation on the content of the scriptures. In classical Advaita Vedanta, the path of knowledge is explained in terms of 3 steps. What are those? Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. Shravana is listening to the scripture. Manana, reflecting on it. But then Nididhyasana is a deeper assimilation of the teachings of the scriptures, trying to internalize them, trying to live them out in your own life. That's the most important part of this. So I think that's what they're referring to here as well. It's a kind of Nididhyasana, put in Vedantic language. Then Bryant says, it then develops further by the practice of yoga that will be outlined in the following sutras. This is not downward dog. What kind of yoga are we talking about here? We're talking about Ashtanga yoga, which is about to come up. We're going to actually start to talk about it very briefly in 2.28 because that's when it's introduced. And then the rest of the chapter explains in detail the 8 limbs of this Ashtanga yoga. Okay? And so through the practice of Ashtanga yoga, we can eventually reach the highest goal. We'll go through the steps in a second. Okay. This discrimination exposes and undermines one's attachments in the form of desires for worldly or heavenly enjoyment, continues Hariharananda, one of these great 20th century Sankhya Yogi monks. In time, discrimination becomes so powerful that the possibility of falling into illusion again becomes completely eradicated, all wrong notions remaining like parched seeds deprived of their potency. Discrimination has now reached a state where it can flow undisturbed. With discrimination in absolute control, the chitta is no longer disturbed, and free from distraction can now reflect on the Purusha. The yogi thus approaches liberation. Okay, and just to give you a slightly different perspective on the same sutra, Swami Vivekananda, he translates the sutra as, the means of destruction of ignorance is unbroken practice of discrimination. Okay, Vivekakyati. And then Swamiji says, this is the real goal of practice, discrimination between the real and the unreal, knowing that the Purusha is not nature, that it is neither matter nor mind, and that because it is not nature, it cannot possibly change. It is only nature which changes, combining and recombining, dissolving continually. When through constant practice we begin to discriminate, ignorance will vanish, and the Purusha will begin to shine in its real nature, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. Okay. I don't think that anything he says here contradicts or is in tension with what Bryant has already explained, but I do think the end of what he says is quite striking. When he says, the Purusha will begin to shine in its real nature, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. I get the feeling, and this is open to debate and discussion, but it feels to me like in moments like this, Swamiji is pushing the yoga philosophy in a Vedantic direction. Because omniscience, okay, maybe that might accord with traditional yoga, the yoga school, but omnipotence, I'm not sure that the yoga school will claim that the Purusha is omnipotent, that it's all-powerful. That's an attribute of the personal God, right? That God is capable of doing anything that's logically possible. But I don't think that would apply to the Purusha, okay, which is, I think it's more like a kind of, it's pure consciousness. It's a kind of eternal witness, completely detached from nature. If it's completely detached, how can it be omnipotent, right? It can't even lift a stone. If there's no connection between Purusha and Prakriti, it can't really do anything in the realm of Prakriti, as far as I can tell. So maybe I'm missing something, but it seems to me that, see, this book, we talked about this in an earlier class. Before we actually went into the Yoga Sutras, we started talking about Swamiji's Raja Yoga. and the preface and the introduction. And there I talked about how this book is a kind of philosophical hybrid text because it brings in ideas, insights from Vedanta. It brings in ideas from Tantra also, especially this idea of Kundalini Yoga, the awakening of the Kundalini. And so it synthesizes Patanjali's yoga philosophy with Vedanta and with aspects of Tantra, especially this Kundalini Yoga. Okay, so I think this is a hint of more of his Vedantic leanings here. It's not strictly true to the school of yoga, but he's kind of Vedantizing yoga philosophy. And then secondly, omnipresence. I don't know. I'd have to do more research on this to verify this, but I'm not sure that the Purusha is omnipresent, partly because in yoga philosophy, there are multiple Purushas, so each of us has a different Purusha. It's not non-dual, but it seems to me that the language he's using here is kind of more Vedantic in a way, that the Purusha is omnipotent and omnipresent, that implying somehow that it's non-dual, okay? Okay, that's something to think about. If you have thoughts about it, please make a comment in YouTube, in the comment section. Okay, but in the meantime, let's look at the next sutra. And please repeat after me, this time with a little bit more feeling. Okay, tasya. Thank you, there we go. Saptadha pranta bhumihi prajna. Okay, the yogi's true insight, the yogi's prajna, has 7 ultimate stages. Saptadha means 7. Pranta bhumihi. This is a bit of a technical term, but pranta means ultimate. Bhumi means, it can mean many things. Remember from the people who attend my gospel class, Sri Ramakrishna sometimes says, the Vedas speak of the 7 planes of consciousness, sapta bhumi. Sapta bhumi, the 7 planes. So there, the right translation would be the 7 planes of consciousness in the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. This is pranta bhumi. These are 7 ultimate bhumis. Now, what exactly these bhumis are, I think it's slightly ambiguous, depending on how you understand what these 7 things are. Bryant calls them stages, but then immediately goes on to qualify that. We'll see in a second. Let's see how he qualifies it. And then we'll get to, you might be curious about what Swami Vivekananda says about it. We'll look at that as well. Okay, so Bryant says, this sutra introduces a 7-fold saptadha division of prajna, insight. We see here that Patanjali did not specify what these 7 stages were, which indicates that he assumed his audience would be familiar with this 7-stepped insight, and that therefore, as noted in the introduction, Patanjali was not the founder of yoga. This type of knowledge was already in circulation. It also reinforces the point that these sutras served as manuals that required unpacking by a teacher. Okay, there's a lot here. First of all, it's quite striking. Usually when Patanjali gives a number like that, like the 5 kleshas, he'll immediately go on to explain, here are the 5 kleshas. Or, whatever it is. But when he gives lists of things, he'll usually just go on to itemize exactly what they are. Here, notably, he says, there are 7 aspects or stages in this knowledge. And then you might, well, okay, so what are they? And then he just moves on to the next topic after that. Okay, so it's a little weird. It might seem a little weird. So that's what Bryant's trying to explain. Why does Patanjali not explain what those 7 ultimate stages are? His suggestion is because they were already well known. They were so well known, in fact, that he didn't feel the need to explain them. They were already in common circulation. Okay? So that kind of idea. Now, whether you buy it or not, that's another thing. But that's what he's suggesting. And it's certainly true that Patanjali was not the founder of this yoga philosophy, just as Shankara was not the founder of Advaita Vedanta, and they have these long traditions. The text might be lost for different reasons, having to do with historical reasons and other things. So he's building on an already existing tradition, but still there's this question of why Patanjali refrains from specifying what these 7 pranta bhumis are, okay? So keep that in mind. The other thing is, how does 2.27 relate to the previous sutra, which explained Viveka Khyati, which is just the immediate step before you attain the highest goal of Kaivalya? Well, the suggestion is, and we'll read the paragraph because it's it gets a little confusing. And it's because Patanjali himself and the commentators, they tend to use a bunch of different terms, Sanskrit technical terms, to refer to things that seem almost identical. Okay, you might think that with the technical philosophical text, that technical terms they'll be using different terms for a good reason, because there might be some subtle differences between them. But it's not so easy to parse exactly what these different terms mean and how they differ from each other. Okay, but the basic understanding of how 2.26 relates to 2.27 is that the Viveka Khyati, the discriminative discernment described in 2.26, is a synonym for prajna, described in 2.27. So you could put an equal sign, more or less, between the Viveka Khyati of 2.26 with the prajna of 2.27. But we'll see that that's a little controversial. It's not obvious, but I think it's plausible. So here's what Bryant says about that. He says, upon examination of how this sevenfold division is understood by the commentators, it seems that several of these stages are essentially different ways of looking at the same state rather than actual sequential stages. Okay, so even though Bryant, I think a little bit misleadingly, even though he translates Prantabhumi in the sutra as 7 ultimate stages, he then immediately goes on to say, but really the way that these commentators explain these 7 bhumis, they don't seem like sequential stages. That you don't have to do 1 followed by 2 followed by 3 all the way up to 7. Swami Vivekananda, interestingly, differs. And he says, the very first sentence of his commentary on Sutra 2.27, he says, by the way, I'll read his translation first. His knowledge is of the sevenfold highest ground. So he's using another translation, equally viable, of the word bhumi, because bhumi has different connotations and different meanings in different contexts. Bhumi can also just mean ground, like literally the ground we're sitting on or standing on. Bhumi. So that's how he chooses to translate it. Obviously not in a literal sense. It's not actual physical ground, but his knowledge is of the sevenfold highest ground. He translates bhumi as ground. And then Swamiji says, when this knowledge comes, it will come, as it were, in 7 grades, one after the other. Notice what he says. Seems to be understood as sequential stages here. Okay. And when one of these begins, we know that we are getting knowledge. And then he explains, and we might come to it, but more or less the 7 stages are more or less along the lines of what Bryant explains using Vyasa in the commentators. Okay, but let's continue, because this is quite important to keep in mind. This applies to the whole text, actually, because this text is full of technical terms. So, Bryant says, with regard to prajna, right, that key term in this sutra, 2.27 is prajna, knowledge. But what is that? And how does it relate to the previous sutra, which talks about Viveka Khyati? With regard to prajna, it seems useful here to note Rukmani's, so who is Rukmani? A very famous scholar of Sankhya and Yoga, T.S. Rukmani. She passed away a few years ago. She was a brilliant scholar based in Canada. And she's done a lot of important work on this subject. In fact, I'll probably be referring to one of her articles today. Okay, so it seems useful here to note Rukmani's reassuring observation that, quote, of the 6 schools of philosophy, yoga is perhaps the one school which has a profusion of technical words used interchangeably. So every school of Indian philosophy has a profusion of technical terms. But in the other schools, the schools other than yoga, if they use 2 different technical terms, they mean 2 different things by them. Otherwise, they're not going to invent different terms. And then she goes on to, this is still a quotation from Rukmani. She says, thus we have, and she gives this laundry list. Don't get a headache. Dharma megha, prasankyana, anyatha khyati, sattva purushanyatha khyati, viveka khyati, that's the word used in 2.26. Prajna, the word used in this verse, in this sutra, 2.27. Ritambhara, pratibhagyana, ekagra chitta, sabijaha, and more, being used more or less in the same sense. All these technical terms, you might assume that they have different meanings. Otherwise, why use all these different terms? But she suggests, and she's one of the best scholars on these philosophies, she says they actually mean more or less the same thing. Okay. It's like, you can call somebody, if you're a mother of a child or something, you might call them by their nickname or something like that, but it's the same thing that's being referred to. Okay. While commentators try to tease out, this is now Bryant, because the Rukmani quote's over. So Bryant says, while commentators try to tease out different semantic nuances, at the very least, these terms overlap considerably. So he's being very nuanced here as a scholar. He's saying, look, I don't mean to say that all of these terms are exactly synonymous, but they're not that different from each other, conceptually speaking. Okay, so, you'll probably be barking up the wrong tree if you see this text, if you have this list of 10 terms and you try to give 10 completely different definitions of what they are and try to put them all together and make coherent sense of how they are interlinked. It's going to be very hard to do that. Okay, and he goes on to explain this. Rukmani concludes that it might not always be fruitful to attempt to extract logical consistency in the usage of terms and concepts in the system. This is a pretty strong statement. Let's read what she says, and then we can think about it. Rukmani says, the conviction grows that this yoga is not something that can be logically described. It is a system that has brought in a number of ideas from so many sources and tried to make sense of them. Yoga was a practical school in which the various steps of prajna and asampragnata were clearly intelligible to the adept in yoga. This is one school which has believed all along in following some well laid down yogic practices. So it is best to accept it as a discipline to be followed rather than to be understood intellectually. Okay. This last sentence is really important. It is best to accept yoga as a discipline to be followed rather than to be understood intellectually. I think this is a little bit disputable. I think we're in danger here. If we push this too far, we might think it's purely a scheme of spiritual practices. But then it could just teach us Ashtanga Yoga. Why does it have to give us all these technical terms and all these complicated philosophical discussions at all? It didn't need to. If you look at the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, there seem to be two very different kinds of teachings in the Gospel all the time. One is extremely practical. When householders come to him and say, what should we do? He says, pray. Sada sadvichara, discriminate between what's permanent, what's impermanent, take the name of God, and so on. These are practical teachings, directly related to spiritual practice. But in the next breath, he's talking about the highest philosophy, about Vijnana Vedanta and about the ultimate reality being both nirguna and saguna, both impersonal and personal. Does God have form? Does God not have form? These are theological questions. These are philosophical questions. He's talking about them all the time. And the two are intimately intertwined, it seems to me. So, I mean, who am I to disagree with Rukmani? But here I go. I feel that this is a text, the Yoga Sutra, that combines, there's a lot of practice, obviously, Ashtanga Yoga, Kriya Yoga, Abhyasa, Vairagya, so it mentions many different spiritual practices. But it's also full of philosophy, and it gives us a kind of philosophical framework. It mentions things like Ishvara, often translated as God, Purusha, Prakriti, and so many terms. And so it gives both, because we need a kind of philosophical framework to support our practice, it seems to me. And so the two, I don't think you can so neatly separate the two things. And so I don't think she gets Patanjali off the hook completely by saying that, because if we really follow what she's saying strictly, then anytime we're confronted with these terms like prajna and viveka, then what's the advice? To just kind of say like, who cares? I mean, I don't think that's quite right. I mean, I think there's a purpose behind using this terminology. Anyway, think about it for yourselves, though. Same thing applies to the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, by the way, because a lot of people, they'll say, because I'm a philosopher, right, an academic philosopher, the worst of all kinds, and so people say, why don't you just focus on the practice? Why do you talk about philosophy? I say, why does Sri Ramakrishna talk about philosophy? Right? There's got to be a reason. He's God himself. Couldn't God have chosen not to teach us philosophy and just focus on practice? Yes, of course he could have. But he taught us philosophy. Why? To waste our time? Probably not. Right? So think about it. Okay. Sermon over. The yogi referred to by Patanjali in this sutra refers to the one in whom discrimination has arisen, says Vyasa. Okay. What kind of discrimination? This highest kind, viveka khyati. When the impure rajasic and tamasic coverings of the chitta have been removed and no further pratyayas, notions, arise in the mind of the discriminating yogi, true insight manifests in 7 aspects. So now notice, Bryant is replacing the word stages with aspects. Okay, so what are these 7 aspects? I didn't have enough room on the board to list out the first 4, so here goes. Listen carefully. 1. And see as I'm explaining these 4, whether it reminds you of anything. 1, that which is to be avoided, suffering, that's the thing that we want to avoid, is known, and there is nothing further to be known in this regard. The very desire to know ceases, says Hariharananda, and thus knowledge itself can cease. Okay, so I know that everything is suffering. What does this remind us of? Very good. The first noble truth of Buddhism. Everything is dukkham. Number 2, the causes of the suffering have been completely eradicated. These causes are the kleshas. And now we can all rattle off what those 5 kleshas are. Ignorance, desire or attachment, attraction, aversion. Oh, I skipped one. What was second? Egoism. And last one? Clinging to life, exactly. Right, those 5. So these causes are the kleshas, the 5 kleshas, and the ensuing karma, as we know. Okay, now, what does this remind us of? The second noble truth, right? Sort of. I mean, because what is the second noble truth of Buddhism? Come on, guys. No? No, that's the 4th. So the second is, so number 1 is everything is, dukkha, and that's often translated as suffering. Arguably, a better translation is unsatisfactory or unfulfilling or something. But what is the cause of this dukkha? Very good. And the Pali word there is tanha, which comes from the Sanskrit word trishna. That's why Bengali, which comes from Sanskrit and all that, when you say I'm thirsty, you say tishta pache, tishta. Tishta, notice the link. Tishta comes from trishna, from Sanskrit. And the Pali is tanha. Okay, so thirst, but thirst for worldly objects, for worldly things. So exactly like that. In Buddhism, the second noble truth is that the cause of suffering is desire, thirst, craving. And here, instead of the word tanha or trishna, the word kleshas is used. But it's the same idea. Because one of those 5 kleshas is desire, craving, right? That's raga. Out of the 5, that's raga. Okay. 3. By Nirodha Samadhi. Nirodha Samadhi is a term that we discussed when we were discussing book 1, chapter 1 of the Yoga Sutras. The Samadhi of restraint, which we recall is how Patanjali defines the entire enterprise of yoga. Because how does he define yoga at the very beginning of the text? Chitta vritti nirodha. Very good. Chitta vritti nirodha. Okay, the cessation of all mental modifications, fluctuations. The removal of the misidentification of Purusha with Buddhi becomes directly realized. Once this misidentification is removed, Asampragyata Samadhi can manifest. Asampragyata Samadhi is the highest state of Samadhi. It's explained in the first chapter. We've already discussed it. Okay, so this corresponds to the third noble truth of Buddhism. Because what is the third noble truth? There is a cessation to suffering. And what is that state called when you're completely liberated from suffering? Exactly. Good guess. Exactly. Nirvana, yes. Right? And so nirvana is not used in the yoga philosophy, but it uses its own term to denote a very similar thing, a state of total liberation from suffering, asampragyata samadhi, or kaivalya. Okay. And then, 4, the means to accomplish this removal of misidentification in the form of discriminative knowledge has been attained. So how do we attain nirvana, according to Buddhists? And they'll say the Ashtanga Marga, the Noble Eightfold Path. And Patanjali says, what's the means to attain total liberation from all suffering? Ashtanga Yoga. Almost exactly the same term is used. Buddhist Ashtanga Marga. Marga just means path. And in yoga philosophy, it's Ashtanga Yoga, the 8-limbed yoga, rather than Marga. So that is the means. And so again, this beautifully corresponds to the 4th noble truth of Buddhism, right? Okay, so those are the first four. Now let's continue. These first four aspects, says Vyasa, pertain to liberation from action or external events. So that's why I wrote that up here. So Vyasa distinguishes the first four from the last three because there are 7 in total, right? What are some things that distinguish 1 through 4 from 5 through 7? 1 through 4 is about attaining liberation from what he calls external events, okay, from action. You don't let the things of the world bother you, basically. Okay. 5 through 7 has to do with liberation from your own mind. What Eckhart Tolle calls the voice in the head. I really like he says he walks on a bus. I mean, we've almost all had this experience, but you walk onto a bus and there's like a crazy person talking to himself. And he says, we're all like that because we've got somebody talking constantly, yapping away in our heads. But we're so identified with that voice that we don't think we're crazy. But if we took a step back, we'd realize that there's this thing just constantly, right? So it's like that. So liberation from the mind is an even higher state, actually. That might also be why Swamiji, remember we talked about this in a previous class, control over internal nature and external nature. He says, right, both these things. First, you have to conquer external nature. So I think that corresponds to 1 through 4. And then there's the even greater struggle, which is conquering the internal nature in the form of the mind. It's the hardest thing to control, right? It's like a drunk monkey bitten by a scorpion. That's the analogy used. It's not, a monkey's already restless, but you give it a lot of Hennessy, and then you throw a scorpion at it, then it's really going to start going crazy. Okay, so that's the mind. Okay, so where were we? Boy, where did I go? Okay. Here we are. Okay. One should note their obvious parallel to the 4 noble truths of Buddhism, which I've already explained. We figured that out. The next 3, 5 through 7, pertain to liberation of the chitta, the mind. Moreover, the first 4, now here's another distinction between 1 through 4 and 5 through 7, according to the traditional commentators. The first 4 are the result of the personal effort of the yogi, say the commentators, unlike the following 3, which arise spontaneously. So 1 through 4 is the realm of self-effort, what's called purushakara. You work hard and you get these results. 5 through 7, they're not going to use grace because that really involves God and all that. This is not that kind of paradigm, arguably. But they'll say that these things arise spontaneously. Okay. I think it's reminiscent of what Sri Ramakrishna says. He says when the mind becomes very sattvic through spiritual practices and by God's grace, the mind itself becomes the guru. And then sattva itself will point the way to the goal. You don't have to consciously make efforts anymore. You'll just kind of be swept along in that current of sattva. So I think that's partly what's meant here. In other words, one need no longer strive to practice yoga at this point. It just kind of happens. These final 3 stages represent the complete cessation of the activities of buddhi. So what are these? 5, 6, and 7. 5. Intelligence has fulfilled its purpose to provide either worldly experience or liberation, bhoga or moksha, apavarga. It has now become redundant. So the intellect is not needed anymore. It becomes redundant. 6. The yogi's gunas dissolve back into their causal matrix, prakriti, and emerge no more, since they no longer have a function. Okay, Hariharananda hastens to point out that the gunas to which Vyasa is referring are the effects of the gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. Why? Not the primordial gunas themselves, which are constituent ontological categories inherent in prakriti, and thus as eternal as is prakriti. Those can never dissolve. Sattva, rajas, and tamas will always be there in some form. But they go from a manifest state, like gunas in the form of this table, to dissolving back into a kind of unmanifest state. That's the idea. But the gunas will remain. Okay. And so then, specifically, it is the subtle body of the chitta, says Vijnana Bhikshu, that dissolves. It's the subtle body, the chitta, which is the thing that reincarnates from life to life. That's the thing that dissolves when you attain liberation. Okay. And that's true across traditions. If you look at devotional traditions, They say, so long as you're stuck in this cycle of rebirth, you have a subtle body. And it's that subtle body along with it depends on the tradition, but typically with the individual soul combined with the subtle body, that's the reincarnating entity. But when you attain liberation, the Jivatma sheds the subtle body perishes, it drops off. And then what's left is the eternal soul, the individual soul. And then that can dwell in a heaven with the personal God if you believe in devotional traditions. Or Advaita Vedanta is more radical, and it says that even that jiva, that individual soul, merges in the non-dual absolute. Okay. But either way, the subtle body dissolves. So yoga philosophy accepts that idea too, that upon liberation, you don't have a subtle body anymore. The subtle body, remember, is physical. It's just insentient matter, actually, but it's a subtle form of insentient matter. And so it'll finally drop off, it'll dissolve. And then finally, even that's not the end. Oh, one thing I should mention about 6 is that this is referred to in 2.10, so a few sutras ago, as pratiprasava, okay? And I mentioned an article by an ex-student, a PhD student of mine back at Vivekananda University, Shushanto Bhattacharya. He wrote an article, an excellent article published in the Journal of Indian Philosophy recently about this concept of pratiprasava in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and how it's been interpreted in different ways. Some claiming that the ultimate pratiprasava involves physical death. And we're going to actually get to this in a second. That's why I end cheerfully with the death of the body here. Okay, so we'll get to that. Okay, so 7. Purusha, removed from the bonds of the gunas, is now eligible to shine forth in its own pure, luminous nature. Again, this language is funny to me, as if it was not eligible before. It's like an eligible bachelor. So anyway, so yeah, it's always already shining forth in its own pure, luminous nature, as far as I can tell. This is called kevala, absolute freedom. The Purusha who has surpassed the gunas and attained these 7 stages of realization is known as an adept, says Vyasa. Again, Bryant is switching back and forth between stages and aspects, and now he's back to stages. In this state, one doesn't actually realize anything because now, by definition, one is fully detached and separated from the organ of realization or discrimination, buddhi. But just as one realizes upon awakening one has slept well, even if one cannot recall the actual experience of sleep, so does the yogi coming out of the state of asampragnata back into external awareness realize that this has been a state free from all suffering. Okay, this is very dense and packed. So he starts to explain this. He says, there are differing views among Hindu schools as to whether this ability to remain embodied, despite having attained asampragnata samadhi. So if you're still in a body after attaining liberation, you're called a jivan mukta, okay, called jivan mukti, liberation while still in the body. Whether it's possible or whether ultimate and absolute liberation can take place only after death. There are big debates about this across the different philosophical schools, both within Hinduism and between Hinduism and Buddhism. And some schools brag about, we say, we do accept Jivan Mukti, and you guys aren't as good as we are because you don't accept Jivan Mukti. So there's something very prestigious about attaining liberation while still in the physical body. Okay, so where does yoga stand? Now, Bryant, I think, gives an overly facile or simplistic answer. Let's see what he says. One can attain this stage even while living, say the yoga commentators, although this will be such a person's last birth. According to Vijnana Bhikshu, the Jivan Mukta, the liberated yogi who is still embodied, may, if he or she wishes, merely witness the stages of insight, pragya, produced by buddhi. There is no sense of ahankara, of wishing to appropriate pragya or misidentify with it as a normal consciousness. So I think what Bryant accurately says is that many of the traditional commentators do affirm Jivan Mukti, and they read this idea of Jivan Mukti, this concept of Jivan Mukti, into Patanjali's text. That's for sure, starting with Vyasa and Vijnana Bhikshu and others. But I think it would be a mistake to generalize about all the traditional commentators. He says, say the yoga commentators. Does he mean all of them? Now, the great Rukmani, the scholar I mentioned and that he mentioned earlier, T.S. Rukmani, she's got articles on this issue. And she says in one of them, let me just read out to you. She says, this is on page 136 of an article she published in Philosophy East and West. She says, my reading of the Yoga Sutras does not convince me that Patanjali had the idea of Jivan Mukti in mind at all. She doesn't think that this text actually even supports the idea of Jivan Mukti, liberation while still in the physical body. She continues, I have all along maintained that yoga is an independent system of thought and have pointed to the many ways in which yoga differs from Sankhya, even though there may be some basic metaphysical agreements. Okay, this is interesting because if you remember, the typical way to explain the different schools of Indian philosophy, we say that there are 6 orthodox schools. And what do we mean by orthodox? Astika is the term. It means that they accept the authority of the Vedas. And then we pair them into three groups of 2. So 3 pairs. What are those? Sankhya and Yoga. Nyaya and Vaisheshika, also paired. Purva Mimamsa, Uttara Mimamsa. What is Uttara Mimamsa? Very good, exactly. Uttara Mimamsa is just another word for Vedanta. But these 6 schools are paired into 3 pairs. Sankhya and Yoga, they're sister schools. They're almost the same, and they'll say that Yoga is more just practice-oriented, Sankhya is more the metaphysical side of it, but they're the same thing. She really pushes, it's an independent system of thought, and that it may not make sense to even pair it with Sankhya. It has a lot in common, but that doesn't mean that it should be paired in that way. It could be misleading to pair them in that way. Then she says, while Jivan Mukti can fit Sankhya, yoga with its twofold division of yoga as sampragyata and asampragyata cannot easily accommodate Jivan Mukti. So the radical stand would be to disagree with Vyasa and all the commentators who argue for a Jivan Mukta stage, similar to the Sankhya or Advaita Vedanta stance. So what she's saying is, there are some schools of Indian philosophy that fully embrace Jivan Mukti. One of them is Sankhya. It overtly says, we accept Jivan Mukti, and it explains it. Advaita Vedanta is a little bit complicated, even though she says that it unambiguously affirms Jivan Mukti. I think that there's a bit of a philosophical issue there. And we can talk about that another time. But what she's saying is, in the yoga philosophy, she finds it difficult to even make philosophical room for a concept of Jivan Mukti because of the whole drift of the text, which is toward asampragyata samadhi. Asampragyata samadhi itself seems to imply that the mind stops functioning. If the mind stops functioning, how can you possibly remain in the world? That's the issue. And so then it seems to be an inevitable result that the ultimate liberation is one that you attain after leaving the physical body. Okay? And she points out that among the traditional commentators, there's at least one major anomaly in the form of bhoja, B-H-O-J-A. And by the way, it's possible that Swami Vivekananda had his hands on Bhoja's commentary, among others, apart from Vyasa's, when he was writing this Raja Yoga, because some of the things he says here aligns with what Bhoja says. So Bhoja does not read Jivan Mukti into this concept of prajna. Whereas Vyasa and Vijnana Bhikshu and most of the other traditional commentators, they tend to say that when you've attained this 7th stage, you're a Jivan Mukta. You've attained liberation while still in the physical body. Okay, but if you really look at all the concepts of Yoga Sutra, especially the Pratiprasava, okay, is it right behind my head? Here it is. Okay, see, when you attain asampragyata samadhi, the mind stops functioning. When the mind stops functioning, the 3 gunas that make up the mind will dissolve back into the causal matrix. Now, what does that mean? In a literal sense, it means you're dead. Sorry. Right? And so that's why some commentators, some scholars, modern scholars, like Ian Witcher is one of them, he's in Canada, they're gonna interpret the term pratiprasava in what's called an epistemological rather than an ontological way. So they're gonna say, yeah, that's a kind of metaphorical way. Dissolution is a metaphorical way of saying that you no longer identify with the buddhi, but it doesn't mean that it actually dissolves back into its elements. So that doesn't entail physical death. And so he's going to defend more of a Jivan Mukti interpretation. All I want to say is we don't have to get into the technicalities and the nuances here, but the point is, keep in mind that there's actually still active controversy and debate about whether Patanjali's philosophical system of yoga actually can accommodate the possibility of Jivan Mukti, liberation, full liberation while still in the physical body. And even Hariharananda Āraṇya seems to suggest that he'll say yes, we accept Jivan Mukti, but then he'll say, but that Jivan Mukta is not fully liberated yet. There's like a little bit, because there's still like the mind is operative. So long as the mind is operative, that can't be total chitta vritti nirodha. It's not possible. Yeah. Can you get the mic to? Well, just people are watching online, so even if you don't need it, others may.
So is it generally understood that Patanjali himself was illumined, the author of the text?
Oh, yeah, certainly, yeah.
So there's Jivan Mukti right there.
Yeah, well, right, exactly. So, Hariharananda Āraṇya, the way that's a good point that you make. Well, wasn't the author of the text supposed to be enlightened? Now, if he's enlightened, doesn't that make him a Jivan Mukta? How can he write a text unless he's in the physical body, right? Yeah, very good, exactly. So, Hariharananda Āraṇya explains this. Let me read this to you. Since you raised the question, it's a very good question. Okay. Okay, he says, on the attainment of discriminative enlightenment, so Viveka Khyati, there is just a touch of ignorance left. Notice what he's saying here. A little trace of ignorance, okay? And the yogin contemplating on the ultimate insights is Jivan Mukta. And so what he's doing is redefining, cleverly, Jivan Mukti, not as total liberation while in the physical body, but almost completely liberated. And then he says, in that state, though faced with misery, he may rise above it with discriminative knowledge. He is thus Jivan Mukta. Even if the yogin lives with a created mind, he is Jivan Mukta. In fact, a yogin living after liberation, that is beyond the touch of misery, is called Jivan Mukta when, though quite capable, he does not take to the state of perpetual liberation by getting into incorporeal emancipation. Okay, what's he saying? He's saying, if this person, after attaining the state of asamprajñata samadhi, feels compassion for the poor suffering souls left on this earth who haven't attained his high state, what does he do? He defers, he puts off the death of the physical body and his ultimate liberation in order to help those people. So we can put Patanjali in that category. He's like the yogic bodhisattva. There's a Vedantic bodhisattva in the form of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnani, and the yogic bodhisattva is like this Jivan Mukta, like a Patanjali, who says, you know what? And like Sri Ramakrishna gives the example of somebody who, there's like 4 friends, and one climbs up, and right before jumping on the other side, he goes, oh my goodness. And his friend's like, what is on the other side? And he just jumps. He doesn't even care to look back. He just jumps to the other side. And then the 2 next friends go. The 4th friend is the one who, he's also equally amazed, but then he's like, wait a minute, if I jump to the other side, then nobody's going to know about it. Let me come back and tell the others about it. So that's like the enlightened Jivan Mukta, who chooses not to cross over the barrier in order to help others. But still, there's this suggestion that there's a trace of ignorance. Do you see what I mean? It's a choice. You choose to. It's like this reminds us of something in our tradition. Sri Ramakrishna praying to Divine Mother to keep his beloved Naren, the future Swami Vivekananda, deluded with her Maya, so that he could do Mother's work. Remember, so it's interesting. It's a kind of you choose. The Jivan Mukta chooses to keep a tiny bit of ignorance in order to help others. Okay. Yeah, very good question. And let's see here. Okay. Now, he says, one must remember that in the yoga system, prajna is still a function of buddhi, and thus of Prakriti's connection with Purusha. And I realize that we're not going to actually get to 2.28, which is good in a way, because 2.28 we start getting into Ashtanga Yoga, and it'll be more appropriate for our next class. We'll talk fully about the 8-limbed yoga. So let's finish off the commentary on 2.27, and then we'll call it a day. So one must remember that in the yoga system, prajna is still a function of buddhi, and thus of Prakriti's connection with Purusha. So we get to a very important point here. Therefore, according to Hariharananda, these 7 steps, so now he's saying steps again, stages, steps, and aspects, do not yet represent the Purusha being in itself, asamprajñata samadhi, but the highest or final level of insight prior to this ultimate samadhi. This is why in my diagram, I've got, okay, so now that we're not going to talk about 2.28 and following, let me just explain my scheme here. Okay, through the practice of Ashtanga Yoga, the 8-limbed yoga, we're going to learn in Sutra 2.28 that the purpose of Ashtanga Yoga is to remove impurities. And those impurities are defined very specifically as the 5 kleshas: ignorance, egoism, attraction, aversion, and clinging to life, right? Okay. What happens when we purify our minds? we attain Viveka Khyati, otherwise known as Prajna. Okay. Is this equivalent to the state of Jivan Mukti? Lord knows. And so most traditional commentators from Vyasa to Vijnana Bhikshu seem to think that it is Jivan Mukta, the state of being a Jivan Mukta. Bhoja disagrees and Rukmani also disagrees. I'm also... it's not, well, hold on. It's a little bit more complicated than that. She might agree that you can call this a Jivan Mukti state, but it's not the full-blown, it's like a misnomer. I think that's what you would say. It's not full mukti. Full mukti will only come at the end when you die. Okay, it's almost mukti. So actually, one of the classical Advaitins, his name was Mandana Mishra, I believe. He wrote a book called Brahma Siddhi. And there, when he's explaining Jivan Mukti, how does he explain it? He says, it's Praya Mukta. The Jivan Mukta, the one who is liberated while in the physical body, is almost Mukta. He used the word Praya. It means almost. It's almost there, but just not quite. Okay, so that might be what this stage is. But notice that it's still not the highest, right? And so this actually maps on pretty well to the Rukmani / Hariharananda understanding, except that they're not comfortable using the word Jivan Mukta then. They're going to say, then don't use the term. Say that the guy is almost liberated. Why use the term Jivan Mukta if it's not Jivan Mukta? Okay, so we have to move on though, because attainment of prajna is then, it culminates in asampragyata samadhi. Asampragyata samadhi is the highest state of samadhi, described in 1.51. Only at that point, only when you have stationed yourself in asampragyata samadhi does the mind completely cease to function. The buddhi just stops working. And then it dissolves back into the causal matrix of prakriti. That's what's called prati prasava in 2.10. That leads to kaivalya. And then you get what Hariharananda also calls absolute liberation, only upon the death of the physical body. This is not an ordinary death. If an ordinary person dies, they have to come back again. But this is death after attaining all of these high states of spiritual illumination and insight. Okay? Okay. And so any questions? This is pretty intense stuff. Online, do we have something? We do. Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. He says, oh, yeah. Okay.
Is it possible ego consciousness or self-awareness arises because of Brahma consciousness? ChatGPT doesn't have Brahma consciousness, therefore no ego consciousness, and hence no suffering nor three gunas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wait, repeat the first, what's the first part?
Is it possible ego consciousness or self-awareness arises because of Brahma consciousness?
Yeah. Right. Okay, so it's a good question, but the thing is we have to be careful not to kind of mix up paradigms here. Okay, because Brahman is not a term used in yoga philosophy. The term Purusha is used, but maybe we can just reformulate it as, does the I sense, does the I consciousness come from the consciousness of the Purusha? Maybe that would be the way to reformulate the question. What is the standard yogic answer? They'll say that we have an I sense because the consciousness of the Purusha is reflected in our buddhi. So we have the illusion of a kind of first-person awareness. Okay, but I still think there are problems with that. I think that it doesn't quite work because just as ChatGPT can't have first-person awareness, it doesn't make sense for something that's insentient to have first-person awareness. So ultimately, if something has to have first-person awareness, it can only be traced back to Purusha itself. And yet, the Purusha is never bound. And so that can't be a good candidate for that entity, that being who feels suffering, who wants to be liberated, right?
So no singularity could ever occur with advanced AI. How they get connected to
Right. So the Vedantic and even the yogic answer or answer to this question of can AI ever be conscious is no. I think just flatly no. It might seem exactly like it's conscious, like no different whatsoever externally from a conscious human being, but internally it can never actually attain first-person awareness. Okay, but it is a little complicated because I was speculating in one of my talks on AI that it might be possible in the future, just as a theoretical possibility, for a jivatma, an individual conscious individual soul, just as it can inhabit plant bodies, right? We Hindus say that plants are ensouled. So now God is omnipotent. So why can't God say like, all right, so now I'm gonna have AI robot bodies being sold by jivas too. I'm just saying as a theoretical possibility, I'm not sure that it's easy to rule out that as a possibility. Yeah.
So I heard a story about Jim Carrey that made me think of this class and things that we've talked about. Like any actor understands that you're playing a character in your daily life as you, and then when you play other characters, you're playing something else. Like you intellectually understand, like I understand me, Draja, I'm a character, but he had this very visceral experience. And I don't know if any of you guys have heard him talk spiritually, but all of a sudden he was like delivering all this spiritual wisdom. And but how his suffering ended was he was playing Andy Kaufman. He was playing an actor, and he would do this thing where he would be Andy during the day on filming, but then stay in Andy's character. But then he also had to play all the different characters that Andy Kaufman played. So in the one movie, he was playing all these characters, and he would stay in character for each section of the movie. And he got so into it that he started to he just realized that Jim Carrey was a completely formed character, not intellectually, but he felt it, you know? And he had this thing where he didn't even know who he was.
I think he no longer identified with the Jim Carrey
at
persona.
all. Yeah.
And so acting in different roles helped him to break his identification.
Yeah, doing so many
eye.
roles at the same time.
That's interesting,
because when he was doing one at a time, it was what any actor always does. But when he was playing so many,
I see.
But he lost, that's how he got to where he is now.
That's a beautiful thing to point out. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and in Vedanta, this whole avasthatraya vichara, or prakriya, avasthatraya, just this deep spiritual reflection on the three states that we enter into every single day. Waking state, dream state, deep sleep state. Right? I think it's moving along the same lines. It's like we're playing these different characters. In the waking state, we have one role. The moment we enter a dream, we're the dream self. The moment we enter deep sleep, we're the no self, or we seemingly no self. And then we come back in the waking state again. And I think partly what Vedanta encourages us is to do the thing that what happened to Jim Carrey in that thing, which is we should recognize that we are this deeper underlying consciousness supporting, or the substratum of all these different superficial characters that go on in these three states again and again, that we're just cycling through again and again without realizing it. And we're not identified with any of those superficial personae. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay, anything else online? Okay, there is, yes.
In the sixth aspect of guna's dissolution is not actually a disappearing, but a diminishment. Diminishment. Right. Is it the balancing of the gunas where they become inert?
Right. Yeah, so I don't think diminishment is quite the right word. They don't disappear, but dissolving back into means it's like a table. If you smash it to pieces, it's going to dissolve back into the earth, but it doesn't disappear, right? So it's going to obey the law of the conservation of matter, of energy. So it doesn't disappear. I don't even think it's diminished, but it's no longer in the form of the subtle body, the mind. Okay. It dissolves back into the causal matrix, into the 5 elements, we can say. Something like that. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, one more. Let's do one more.
Is there a difference between the subtle body and the causal body? If so, which is the one that gets reincarnated, the former or the latter?
Right. Okay, so it's the subtle body that reincarnates. It gets complicated, actually, and I talk about it in my book, the new book that just came out, Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism. I have a little section talking about how Sankhya and Yoga may have slightly different answers to the question, who or what exactly is the reincarnating entity? In Sankhya, the answer is very clear. Whether it's coherent is another question, but it's clear. The answer is the subtle body, linga. They call it linga sharira, which is just the Sanskrit term for subtle body. Patanjali, it's complicated. There's another question. Just as Rukmani is questioning whether there's a concept of jivan mukti in Patanjali's system, we can also question whether there's a concept of subtle body in Patanjali's yoga system. He doesn't mention a subtle body anywhere in the entire text, let alone a causal body. I mean, this questioner is bringing in causal body. That's a concept used in Vedanta. And remember what I said to the earlier questioner is that it's important not to mix up philosophical paradigms, and so we should be careful. Causal body is not a term that's used by the commentators or by Patanjali here, and so we should better to avoid it. The reincarnating entity could be the subtle body, but Yoga Sutras, the commentators tend to use the term chitta, and it may not be individual, like you would have one subtle body and you would have another subtle body. The Patanjali view, or the view of some of the main traditional commentators on Patanjali's text, is that there's one chitta, which is kind of all-pervasive. There's an all-pervasive chitta or mind, which sort of like in a particular birth, it's very hard to explain this, and it's very unclear even in the texts themselves. But they somehow avoid positing a separate subtle body for each reincarnating entity, and instead say there's an all-pervasive chitta, and that they think that does the job, basically. Now, how exactly it does it, you can try to make sense of the paragraph in my book, but it's not super easy to understand. Okay. Yes. So, but there are other commentators who then therefore say that we should bring in a subtle body in order to explain reincarnation, even within Patanjali's system. But it's up for grabs. Okay? Any in-person question, or are we good now? We're good. All right. Thank you, everyone. And hope to see you next month. Going to Texas for a few days. Jai Ma. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.